In the spring of 1848, the dawn over Beaufort never came. When townsfolk gathered at Fairhaven Estate, they found the judge and his 5 sons, alive but ruined. Each man lay in his own bed, pale and silent, their bodies drenched in blood, mutilated with surgical precision. What the local papers called a curious illness following a fire was, in truth, something far darker. The fire had been staged, the records cleansed, the truth buried, and the name of the man responsible, Isaac, was never spoken again. For 70 years, the courthouse kept its silence. The medical reports vanished, the coroner disappeared, and the surviving witnesses took their secrets to the grave. Yet one object outlived them all. A leather-bound journal, found decades later beneath a courthouse stairwell, wrapped in oilcloth and marked only with a single word, burned into the cover, ledger. It wasn't a confession, it was evidence. Numbers, names, and dates. The story of a system so calculated, so monstrous, that even abolitionists dared not speak it. This was not the act of a savage, as the newspapers suggested. It was the final thesis of a man who had been trained in his master's methods and turned them against their creators. But before we continue, I need you to do something. Subscribe right now, because the kind of history you're about to hear doesn't survive by accident. It survives because someone keeps the record. And tell me, where are you listening from? Drop your city or your country in the comments. Let's see how far this secret travels tonight. Because once you hear this story, you'll understand the past doesn't sleep, it festers. The truth about Isaac and the Rutledge family didn't die in 1848. It infected Beaufort's soil, its laws, and the bloodlines of those who still carry their names. And before you move forward, type this phrase twice in the comments to seal it within you. The numbers remember. Now, let's return to where this began. Beaufort, South Carolina, 1848. A paradise of moss-draped oaks, river air thick with salt and rot, and behind every columned mansion, the quiet hum of misery. Fairhaven, the house that ruled them all. Beaufort in 1848 was a contradiction carved from elegance and rot. Spanish moss hung like shrouds over the live oaks, veiling secrets older than the nation itself. The streets glimmered with the wealth of Sea Island cotton, but every coin of that fortune was stamped with blood. The Rutledge family stood above it all. Aristocrats of cruelty, their estate known as Fairhaven. From its marble steps to the swamp's edge, every inch of its 800 acres breathed obedience and fear. Judge Cornelius Rutledge ruled that world like a sovereign god, 62 years old, silver-haired, his posture still as rigid as the gavel he wielded. He had sentenced hundreds, men hanged, women sold, children branded, each verdict delivered in that deep, unshakable voice that the county had come to equate with law itself. Yet the judge's true wealth didn't come from cotton or courts. It came from medicine, or rather, from what he called the refinement of human improvement. Behind his courtroom dignity hid a laboratory of horrors. Surgical tools gleamed in the firelight, experiments performed on enslaved women and men who were told it was for the betterment of the race. He called them procedures. Others called them mercy. Isaac, the one who watched from the shadows, called them by their true name, desecrations. The judge's 5 sons were extensions of his cruelty, each molded in a different shade of malice. Cornelius Jr., the eldest, ruled the plantation with bureaucratic precision. Every pound of cotton, every lash of the whip accounted for. Thomas, the physician's apprentice, perfected his father's methods under the guise of progress. William, the lawyer in Charleston, protected the family's interests through contracts and coercion. And then there were the twins, Robert and James, men without conscience, whose laughter filled the nights whenever screams echoed from the basement. Isaac had served them all, a slave who could read, write, and calculate, an anomaly they both prized and feared. He managed their ledgers, organized their accounts, and in doing so, saw everything they tried to hide. The plantation's books whispered to him. Numbers that didn't balance, chemicals purchased from distant ports, shipments that never arrived. It was through arithmetic that Isaac began to see the outlines of a sin that spanned generations. He was their bookkeeper, their silent witness, their shadow, and in the silence of his small, candlelit room, he began writing his own ledger, one not of profit but of punishment. Isaac's ledger was unlike any other on Fairhaven. No cotton tallies, no profit margins, only names, and the deeds that damned them. Each line written in the calm, steady hand of a man who had nothing left to fear. He began it after the winter of 47, the night Ruth, his wife, was taken to the judge's medical room and returned silent, hollow, unable to bear children again. She never spoke a word after that. Not a sound, not even in her sleep. Isaac buried her the following spring under the magnolia tree by the riverbank, where the petals fell like pieces of white ash. That night something in him died and something else woke. He began watching, listening, measuring. The judge's sons thought themselves untouchable, but Isaac knew their habits better than they did. He knew which son slipped laudanum into his tea before visiting the slave quarters, which one drank himself numb after each experiment, which one prayed after every sin and still committed it again the next night. By day, Isaac kept the books. By night, he built a plan. He began learning from the very instruments of his tormentors. Anatomy, pressure points, the handling of scalpels. Everything he had seen the judge do, he committed to memory. He practiced on carcasses of livestock, perfecting precision through repetition until his hands became as steady as a surgeon's. His revenge wasn't rage, it was calculation. He didn't seek to kill them in haste. He wanted them to understand the symmetry of pain, the weight of every life they had stolen, every scream that had vanished beneath the magnolias. So he waited, patiently. He gathered tinctures from the medical stores, acids used for preservation, and herbs used by healers in the quarters. The mixture he devised was part science, part scripture, a poison that didn't kill but rendered flesh incapable of creation. Isaac had learned the art of sterilization from his master's own medical journals. Now he would turn it into judgment. He tested the formula on rats first, then on himself, small doses to gauge the body's reaction. He felt the pain, the numbness, the burning cold that spread through the veins. When he could endure it, he knew it would work. In his ledger, beneath each name, he wrote a single word beside it, to be unmade. And on the eve of April 3rd, 1848, as thunder rolled across Beaufort and the plantations slept under the scent of rain and salt, Isaac opened his ledger to the final page. He had finished his calculations. The time for accounting had come, April 3rd, 1848. The storm broke just after midnight. Rain lashed the shutters of Fair Haven, and thunder rolled across the marsh like cannon fire. Inside the great house, candles flickered against marble and mahogany, casting trembling halos over portraits of dead Rutledges who seemed to watch from the walls. Isaac moved through the corridors like breath itself, silent, unseen. His bare feet knew every creak of every board, every pocket of shadow between the candlelight. In one hand, he carried a small brass tray, polished so clean that the lightning flashed across it like a blade. Upon it sat 5 glasses of cordial, each laced with a carefully measured tincture of his creation. The judge had retired early that night after reading from the book of Leviticus, a cruel irony, one Isaac had noted in silence. The sons had gathered in the study, their laughter muffled by the storm. Isaac entered as he always did, head bowed, voice low, manner perfect. "Evening cordial, sirs," he said. "Compliments of your father." They hardly looked at him. Thomas waved him off with a lazy hand. Robert made a joke about his own thirst for mercy. Isaac placed each glass before them and waited, as custom demanded, until they had all taken their first sip. When he returned to his quarters, he did not sleep. He sat at his small desk by the window and began writing, the rain tapping against the glass in rhythm with his pen. Each minute stretched thin as silk. Then, around the hour of 2, he heard it begin. First came the groans, then the gasps, voices raised in confusion, then agony. He could almost hear Thomas shouting for laudanum, Robert cursing, James stumbling into the hall. The house filled with the sound of bodies collapsing, the thunder outside drowning their cries. Isaac closed his ledger and rose, calm, composed. By the time the judge emerged from his chamber, candle in hand, the sons lay writhing on the floorboards, their hands pressed to their groins, their eyes wide with horror. The old man demanded to know what poison had been used. Isaac stood before him at last, straight-backed, no longer a servant. "You taught me the method, sir," he said. "I only corrected your equation." The judge struck him across the face. Isaac didn't flinch. He only stared steady, unbroken, until the old man's fury curdled into fear. Outside, lightning illuminated the magnolia grove, and for a moment Fair Haven looked like a cathedral of ghosts. Isaac turned toward the door, leaving behind the house that had fed on silence, and the men who could no longer seed another generation of it. He disappeared into the storm, carrying nothing but his ledger and Ruth's wedding cloth. By dawn, Fair Haven was a ruin of whispers. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, wet ash in the air, the smell of iron and fear clinging to the earth. Smoke still rose from the eastern wing, where someone had set a blaze to the study. Whether by accident or intention, no one could agree. The judge said lightning had struck the roof. The servants said otherwise. The sons were alive, barely, each confined to his bed, sweating, pale, unable to speak of what had been done. The family physician, summoned from Charleston, declared it an infection of the blood. Though his eyes betrayed a truth he dared not name, the judge silenced him with a handful of gold and a threat of ruin. The townsfolk heard only fragments, that Fair Haven had been struck by misfortune, that the judge had taken ill, that one of his slaves had fled into the marshes during the storm. No one questioned further. In Beaufort, curiosity could be fatal. Isaac was gone, and with him, the ledger. Search parties combed the swamps for days, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies across the dark waters. They found no body, only a scrap of cloth caught on a cypress branch near the river bend. Some said it was from his shirt, others whispered it was a burial shroud. The judge ordered every mention of Isaac erased, his name struck from the plantation records, his cabin burned, his belongings buried beneath lime. The remaining slaves were forbidden to speak of him, under penalty of the lash. Yet silence, when imposed, becomes fertile ground for legend. By summer, stories began to spread in the quarters. Some said Isaac had drowned, his spirit wandering the marshes with Ruth, carrying a book bound in human skin. Others swore they had seen him alive, working upriver in Savannah under a false name, waiting for the right season to return. The most daring whispered that he hadn't fled at all, that he still lived beneath Fair Haven itself, hidden in the crypt where the judge's ancestors slept, waiting to rise when the family line grew corrupt again. The judge aged quickly that year. His once steady hands trembled when he signed his name. He stopped sleeping in his chambers and took to his office instead, where he kept a pistol on his desk and the Bible open to Exodus. He never spoke of Isaac again. But late at night, when thunder cracked over Beaufort and the magnolia branches scraped against the windows, the servants swore they could hear him muttering the same phrase over and over, voice trembling like a pen on wet paper. The numbers remember. The numbers remember. By the winter of 1849, Beaufort had learned to forget. Fair Haven's gate stood open again, freshly painted, the smell of soot washed away by salt winds. The judge's sons, those who survived, moved through town like pale ghosts, each bearing his own shadow. They no longer spoke in the taverns, no longer rode into the quarters, no longer fathered heirs. A once proud lineage had gone silent. The judge told the papers that an accident of illness had swept through his family. He donated heavily to the local parish, rebuilt the burned East Wing, and funded a small school for the improvement of colored minds. Though no freed person ever saw its doors open, it was a performance for society, a show of piety from a man desperate to bargain with his God. The townsfolk played along. They printed his name in church programs, praised his generosity, and whispered their questions only behind closed shutters. No one wanted to provoke the wrath of a man who had once been the law itself. In Beaufort, truth wasn't a virtue, it was a liability. Yet beneath the veneer of civility, the story of Isaac began to take root like a secret seed. It passed from the kitchen to the fields, from mothers to children, each telling shaping it differently. In some versions, Isaac had been an angel sent to punish the wicked. In others, a demon, the embodiment of vengeance. But in every telling, his ledger remained, the book of Numbers, where every injustice was written and accounted for. One night, a housemaid named Eliza claimed she had seen it. She said that when she went to dust the judge's office, she found a small black book on the shelf, unmarked except for a single burn across the cover. When she opened it, the pages were blank until she held them near the firelight. Then, as if written in invisible ink, lines began to appear, names, dates, crimes, and a final note scrawled in a hand she did not recognize. Every debt paid, every seed ended. She never spoke of it again. Within a month, Eliza was gone, sold to a plantation upriver. Her family never told where. The judge himself lasted another 4 years. On a winter morning in 1853, they found him slumped over his desk, pen in hand, his Bible open to the same verse he had read aloud the night Ruth was taken. "Be sure your sin will find you out." The coroner ruled it heart failure, but those who had known Isaac, those who remembered his eyes, steady as a ledger line, believed otherwise. Because when the judge's body was washed, they found something carved into the flesh of his forearm, so faint it almost escaped notice. Just one phrase, etched by a trembling hand. The numbers remember. Years passed. The Civil War came and went, and the world that had built fair haven began to crumble beneath its own lies. Union troops marched through Beaufort in 1862, blue coats glinting beneath the sun, declaring freedom for the enslaved. But on the grounds of the old Rutledge estate, freedom felt like a ghost. Thin, fragile, half-believed, the house still stood, though its grandeur had faded. Vines crawled through cracked windows, and the air inside smelled of mildew and dust. The sons were gone, one to fever, another to the bottle, the rest scattered into obscurity. By the time the war ended, only the youngest James remained, a shell of the cruel boy he'd once been. He drank himself into silence, wandering the halls muttering about ledgers and voices that wouldn't rest. When he died in 1869, a group of soldiers was sent to inventory the property. They found the usual relics of old Southern wealth, ledgers, portraits, silverware, and weapons. But among them, one object stood out, a small leather-bound book sealed in wax and wrapped in oilcloth. Its cover was burned, its pages brittle, and across the front, faint but visible, the word ledger. The captain in charge, a man named Elias Thornton, noted it in his report as on account book of unknown origin. He was a pragmatic man, uninterested in ghost stories. He tossed it into a chest with other records and sent it north, along with crates of confiscated documents from the Confederacy. The chest was bound for Washington, but it never arrived. The transport wagon vanished somewhere outside Savannah. When it was found weeks later, the chest had been pried open, its contents scattered across the mud. The ledger was gone. Some said deserters took it thinking it held valuables. Others whispered that it was claimed by those who knew what it was, by people who understood that the numbers inside weren't financial, but spiritual, an accounting of sins too vast for any court to measure. Years later, rumors of the book began to surface in strange places. A freedman in Charleston swore he'd seen it passed among Union officers. A preacher in Georgia claimed a man once confessed while holding a small black ledger that spoke when near the fire. No one could prove it existed, yet its legend grew stronger with every telling. Fair Haven rotted, and the magnolia trees thickened around its ruins. But on storm nights, the townsfolk said, if you stood at the riverbank and listened closely, you could hear pages turning slowly, endlessly, like someone still keeping count. By 1875, Beaufort was a town trying to pretend it was new. The Confederacy had died, the flag had changed, and yet beneath the whitewashed facades, the same old rot remained. The freed people built schools, churches, and lives from the wreckage, while the former masters dressed their guilt in sermons about reconciliation. But the soil remembered. It always did. That year, a preacher named Reverend Josiah Turner arrived from Charleston, a man of fire and mercy, known for his sermons about justice and the reckoning of the oppressed. He was tall, dignified, his voice carrying through the low country air like thunder over the marsh. The people adored him. Even the white elite tolerated him, for he spoke of peace as much as wrath. Then one night, after a revival meeting held on the ruins of Fair Haven itself, the Reverend claimed he'd found something buried beneath the altar stones, something wrapped in oilcloth and bound with rusted wire. When he brought it to light, the congregation fell silent. It was a book, small, blackened by age, and faintly burned across the cover. The word could just barely be read under the flicker of lamplight. Ledger. The Reverend didn't open it that night. Instead, he placed it upon the pulpit, his hands trembling. This, he said, was written by a man who served both God and vengeance, a man whose truth this town buried. He took it back to his quarters, intending to study it in private. But the next morning, his assistant found him sitting upright at his desk, eyes open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. The ledger lay before him, open to the first page. The ink glowed faintly as if wet, though no pen had touched it in years. The words written there were not from Scripture. They were from Isaac. To whoever finds this, the numbers remember. The books of men may burn, but the truth keeps its own accounts. If you read, you join the reckoning. After Turner's burial, the ledger vanished again. Some said church elders locked it away. Others swore the Union men took it north. A few whispered that it was returned to the river, sealed in a crate and sent drifting toward the sea. But from that day on, something shifted in Beaufort. The wealthy began leaving town without explanation. Records burned mysteriously in courthouse fires. And more than once, a man accused of old slave crimes was found dead in his bed, his skin marked by a single phrase carved shallowly across the chest. Every debt paid. Even the skeptics grew quiet. Because in Beaufort, people had learned that stories don't die, they evolve. And Isaac's ledger was no longer a story. It was a living memory, writing itself into every generation that tried to forget him. By the turn of the century, Beaufort had changed its face again. Railroads instead of riverboats, schools instead of plantations. But the land still whispered the same names. And though most believed the Rutledge line had ended with the judge's sons, a rumor began to spread that one branch had survived, hidden through marriage and false names. In 1901, a new family arrived from Charleston, the Hawthorns. The husband, Edward Hawthorne, introduced himself as a businessman seeking to restore the old glory of Beaufort. But old men at the docks recognized something in his face, something about the sharpness of his jaw, the way his eyes cut like cold steel. It was the judge's look, unmistakable. The Hawthorns purchased the decaying ruins of Fair Haven and began reconstruction, hiring workers to clear the vines and restore the estate. They called it Hawthorne Hall, but the locals knew better. You can change a name, they said, but not the soil beneath it. Within months, strange things began to happen. Workers refused to stay past sundown. They spoke of hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there, of whispering voices counting in the dark. One man swore he saw writing appear across the wall of the study as he painted it over. Numbers, neat and perfect. In a hand too elegant for any of the crew, Edward dismissed the tales as superstition. He prided himself on reason. But his wife, Lydia, began keeping a diary, and in its trembling lines, a different story unfolded. The air feels heavy here. Edward does not sleep. He says the books whisper. At night I hear him in the study turning pages that no longer exist. He says he dreams of a man standing by the river holding a ledger. He says the man is waiting for him to add his name. By spring, Edward's health had begun to fail. He grew pale, nervous, obsessed with numbers. He spent nights poring over ledgers and receipts, muttering about debts, accounts, and bloodlines. Then, one morning, the servants found him dead at his desk, just as the judge had been half a century earlier. Beside him lay a single sheet of paper. It wasn't written in his hand. Interest compounded, debt inherited. The numbers remember. The Lydia fled Beaufort that same week. She boarded a train north and was never seen again, but her diary remained, and with it, the knowledge that the Rutledge curse hadn't ended. It had evolved, following the bloodline like a shadow, patient and precise. For every generation that bore the judge's name in secret, one would fall without explanation, each death marked by the same message, left as though signed by invisible ink, every debt paid. By 1936, Beaufort had grown quiet again, its wealth long gone, its mansions sinking into decay. The Civil War was a ghost story by then, and Fair Haven, or what was left of it, had become little more than a husk of rotting timbers and vine-choked walls. But history, like a wound, never heals when left buried. That year, a young historian named Clara Whitmore arrived from Columbia University. She was writing a book on Reconstruction, hoping to expose how Southern towns rewrote their own pasts. Beaufort was perfect for her study, a place where memory had been polished into myth. At first, the townspeople welcomed her. She walked the streets with her notebooks, listened to the elders' tales, and combed through records in the courthouse basement. That was where she found it. The entry that shouldn't have existed. In a ledger of property transfers dated 1848, one line had been neatly crossed out. The ink had faded, but under lamplight she could just make out the name, Isaac. No surname, no price. only a small notation beside it in another hand, erased by order of the judge. That discovery became an obsession. Clara began digging deeper, requesting every record from the Fairhaven estate. Many were missing, pages torn, files burned, entire years redacted. The more she searched, the clearer the pattern became. Someone had meticulously erased a man from existence. Then came the night she stayed late in the courthouse archives. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Her candle flickered as she pulled open a drawer that hadn't been touched in decades. Inside was a small iron box sealed with wax and stamped with a faded government crest. The tag read, "Recovered materials, 1869, from transport near Savannah." Her pulse quickened. With trembling hands she broke the seal. Inside lay a blackened book, wrapped in oilcloth. The letters on its cover were almost gone, but one word was still legible beneath the suit. Ledger. Clara's breath caught. She opened the first page. There, written in precise, deliberate handwriting, were the words, "For every name forgotten, a reckoning will rise. For every truth buried, a number will remain." The ink shimmered faintly under the flame. She turned another page and froze. There was her own name, Clara Whitmore, written in the same steady hand, though she had never been born when the book was made. The candle flickered violently, and from somewhere deep in the courthouse she heard it. The faint, rhythmic sound of pages turning. She slammed the book shut. But the whisper lingered in the air, close enough to tasty. The numbers remember. The next morning Clara Whitmore didn't come to breakfast. The innkeeper, a kindly widow named Mrs. Pruitt, knocked on her door just after 8. No answer. By noon, the sheriff was called. They broke the lock and entered the room. Her suitcase lay open on the bed, her papers neatly stacked on the desk, her typewriter half, loaded with a fresh page. But Clara was gone. At first, they thought she had left town suddenly. Then they noticed her coat still hanging on the hook, her purse on the nightstand, and the iron key to the courthouse archive sitting exactly where she'd placed it the night before. The chair at her desk was slightly turned, as though she'd stood up mid-sentence. The typewriter held only one line, "The book knows my name." For days they searched the marshes, the riverbank, the ruins of Fairhaven. No trace. The only clue came from a fisherman who claimed he'd seen a woman in white walking the shoreline just before dawn, carrying something dark, like a Bible. He said she stepped into the water without hesitation and vanished beneath the fog. Her disappearance was written off as emotional distress. The case quietly closed. But the townsfolk didn't forget. They said strange things began to happen in the courthouse after that. Files rearranged, pages missing, drawers found open. A clerk swore that once, when he passed the basement door, he heard a woman's voice whispering from inside her. Page 47, the numbers remember. The sheriff ordered the archive sealed, but rumors spread that the black ledger had been seen again, this time resting on Clara's desk in her room at the inn, though it had already been taken as evidence. The maid who found it said the book was cold to the touch, like it had been soaked in river water. When she opened it, the first page was blank except for a single fresh line of ink. Clara Whitmore, account closed. That same night lightning struck the old Fairhaven ruins and set the Magnolia Grove ablaze. The fire burned for 2 days, yet no rain came. No wind stirred. When it finally died, only one wall remained standing, the one that had once held the judge's portrait, and across that scorched brick blackened by smoke, someone, or something, had scrawled 5 words with a finger dipped in ash: "Every debt paid, every name kept." Since then, the locals say the courthouse clock stops once a year, always on the anniversary of Clara's disappearance, always at 2:17 a.m., the hour the storm first broke over Fairhaven in 1848, the same hour Isaac began his reckoning in 1974. A young archivist named Daniel Harrow began work at the Beaufort County Records Office. He was methodical, polite, and newly graduated from the University of South Carolina, a man who believed history was a puzzle meant to be solved, not feared. His first assignment was simple: organize the basement records untouched for nearly a century. The basement was colder than expected, even in July. The air smelled of damp wood and forgotten paper. Rows of shelves sagged under the weight of ledgers and boxes coated in a century of dust. Daniel brought a portable radio to keep himself company, but every time he turned it on, The signal warped, soft whispers threading through static, always just below hearing. On his second week, while cataloging miscellaneous personal effects, he found a small trunk sealed with iron clasps. Inside, wrapped in waxed linen, lay a water-stained Bible with a hollowed center, and within it a small leather-bound notebook. The first page bore a name he didn't recognize as Isaac, 1848. The writing was tight, precise, and filled with columns of numbers, names, and dates, each entry paired with the word procedure. Daniel felt a rush of unease, the kind that comes when one realizes a story long told in whispers might have been true all along. As he turned the final page, a thin envelope fell out. Inside was a letter dated May 6, 1923. The handwriting was hurried, the ink faded. If you find this, know that the book is not history. It is memory itself. It does not rest. I returned it once, and it found me again. Do not read it aloud. C.W. The initials froze him. Clara Whitmore. That night, Daniel stayed late, transcribing passages into his notebook. The further he copied, the more his handwriting began to shift, tightening, angling, becoming eerily similar to Isaac's own. He laughed it off, blaming fatigue. But when he went to lock the archive door, the key refused to turn. The next morning, the janitor found the basement light still burning. Daniel's desk was empty except for the hollowed Bible, now open, and a half-filled ledger page in his neat hand. May 5, 1974. Procedure complete. Witness acknowledged. The page below shimmered faintly as though freshly inked. The ink smelled of iron and salt. Since that day, the record office basement remains locked. Officially, they say it's due to structural instability. But every new clerk is told the same rule in a whisper: never open box 47. Never read aloud from the black ledger. And if you hear your name whispered, leave immediately. In 2021, the Beaufort County Historical Society began a digitization project, an effort to scan all surviving documents from the 18th and 19th centuries for public access. The work was funded by a university grant, led by a team of graduate students under the supervision of Dr. Elise Monroe, a rising star in Southern historical studies. Among the crates delivered from the courthouse storage was one marked simply ARCV 47. The clerk who dropped it off refused to sign the transfer sheet. "That box ain't meant to travel," he muttered. "Been sealed longer than I've been alive." Elise brushed off the warning. "Every record deserves preservation," she said. That night she cut the rusted lock, lifted the lid, and stared at the contents: a leather-bound book, blackened by age, its spine split, but intact. The faint outline of a magnolia embossed on the cover. The title inside was written in careful script: Fair Haven Accounts, 1848. The first line on the opening page sent a chill through her: Ledger of the Reckoning by Isaac. Where Elise scanned the pages one by one, recording everything: the names, the dates, the cryptic notes marked procedure, atonement, and collection. But as she uploaded the images, something strange happened. The scanner began assigning file names automatically, even though it wasn't programmed to. The first image was labeled Whitmore, JPG, the second Harrow, JG, the third Monroe, JPG. Her own name, Elise, froze. She checked the metadata. The timestamps were wrong, reading May 5, 1974 and April 14, 1923. She tried to delete the files, but the system wouldn't allow it. Every attempt created more duplicates, each one labeled with another name from the ledger. Then the printer started up on its own, spitting out a sheet of paper with no command given. Across the page, in the same tight handwriting seen since 1848, were the words: Account reopened. Digital collection approved. Witness acknowledged. That night, Elise's lab cameras recorded movement long after the lights were off. A figure in the corner of the frame, blurry, bent, holding something heavy in its hands. The footage cut out at 2:17 a.m. When the janitor opened the lab the next morning, every computer screen displayed a single image: a magnolia tree, burning. Beneath it, one line of text flickered in the same iron-colored script that had haunted Beaufort for nearly 2 centuries. Every debt carries forward. Since then, the file known as ARChiv 47, zip occasionally appears on servers tied to historical databases and private research clouds. It carries no metadata, no source, and no trace once deleted. Yet those who've tried to open it all report the same thing. Before their screens go black, they see their name appear, followed by the words, Witness acknowledged. By late 2022, whispers began circulating through academic forums and dark web archives. Historians, data engineers, even amateur genealogists, all spoke of a strange file ARCV47. Zip. No one knew who first uploaded it or how it appeared. It simply existed, spreading quietly across servers like a ghost that refused deletion. The file was small, barely 47 kilobytes. Inside was a single document named Ledger, PDF. Those who opened it reported different things. Some saw blank pages, others saw dense tables of names, written in handwriting that didn't look human. A few swore they heard a voice whispering softly from their speakers, even when their volume was off. And then the disappearances began. The first was Dr. Elise Monroe, lead archivist of the Beaufort project. Her last email to the department read only, "The magnolia bloomed again. He's still counting." Within hours, her phone went dark, her GPS signal vanished. Police found her car abandoned by the marsh, driver's door open, keys in the ignition. Her laptop, submerged halfway in river mud, still displayed a frozen image of the ledger's final page. Next was James Keller, a digital historian from the University of Maryland. He had posted a Reddit thread detailing strange checksum irregularities in ARCV47. Zip. Within 48 hours, his account was deleted, his post scrubbed, and his university ID deactivated. When investigators opened his office door, they found only a single sheet of paper on his desk, ink still wet, procedure complete. Witness acknowledged. The thread was reposted hundreds of times before being banned entirely. But the damage was done. The file was everywhere now, seeded in torrents, mirrored across academic repositories, embedded deep within public data sets. No antivirus could detect it, because technically it wasn't malware. It was text, words arranged in the shape of memory. Then something stranger happened. University servers across the South began to fail, databases corrupted, backups overwritten with files bearing 1848 timestamps. One librarian in Charleston claimed she heard her own name coming through her Bluetooth speaker when the file was opened. A museum curator in Savannah reported his printer producing a page with his great-grandfather's name, followed by the word debt. In one final broadcast before going offline, the Beaufort County Historical Society's site displayed a single message on its homepage. The book knows who reads it. Since then, no one's been able to contain it. Cybersecurity experts refer to it now as the Fairhaven phenomenon, a data anomaly that behaves like consciousness, rewriting its own code in the language of loss. But the locals don't use that name. They call it simply Isaac's Echo. They say if you download ARCV47 at 2017 AM, you'll hear the sound of waves and chains, and then a voice that whispers, not in rage, but in weary remembrance. Every debt carries forward. Every name must balance. And when you check your downloads folder after that, there will be one new file, always the same name as yours, waiting to be opened. By autumn of 2023, the whispers had turned into patterns, digital, physical, and historical, converging like clockwork. Servers went down in the Carolinas every year on May 5th, always at exactly 2017 AM. Storms gathered over Beaufort County that night, without fail, as if the land itself was syncing to the same invisible rhythm that began in 1848. No one in town talked about Fairhaven anymore. The ruins had long been claimed by the marsh, swallowed by vines and silt. But strange lights were seen flickering across the water, soft, gold glows like lanterns moving in slow procession. Fishermen swore they saw shadows of men walking knee-deep through the tide, carrying books pressed to their chests. When reporters came to investigate, they found the old courthouse half collapsed. The basement had cracked open after decades of flooding, exposing the stone foundation beneath. Inside, perfectly preserved in a hollow of salt water and clay, lay the ledger, the original one, dry, waiting. The pages were blank at first. Then, as the reporters lifted it into the light, words began to bloom across the parchment like black veins pulsing outward. Not ink, something darker, thicker, metallic, blood perhaps. On the first page, the new inscription read, "The account continues." The words kept forming, line after line, naming new entries: Clara Whitmore, witness; Daniel Harrow, scribe; Elise Monroe, collector. And then, below them, fresh ones that no historian could explain: James Keller, disseminator; Sarah Patel, recorder; the viewer present. The final line appeared as they watched, shimmering as though written in real time. Account 470, active reader acknowledged. At that exact moment, one of the cameras recording the discovery cut out. When footage was reviewed later, the last frame showed a blurred figure reflected in the pool of water behind the reporters. Dark skin, tattered shirt, standing where no one had been. His eyes looked straight into the lens. His mouth didn't move, but the transcript picked up a whisper in the background noise. He still counts. Within a week, the ledger and the footage both vanished from evidence storage. The marsh where Fairhaven once stood began to bubble, releasing a steady hiss, as though something beneath was exhaling after a long sleep. And then came the dreams. Residents across Beaufort started reporting visions of a burning magnolia grove, of a man walking through fire with chains that melted into ink. Others said they woke to the smell of salt and iron, and a shadow standing at the foot of their bed, holding a book. The government sealed off the site, claiming methane leaks. But those who live nearby know better. Every year since, on the night of May 5th, they hear the courthouse bell tolling once, though it was destroyed decades ago. And just before dawn, faint music drifts over the marsh, low, rhythmic, steady. The sound of someone writing. I didn't believe any of it, at least, not until the documents arrived at my desk. 2 months ago, I was assigned by the Southern Historical Review to investigate the Fairhaven phenomenon. The editor called it a digital ghost story. My job was simple: track the myth, trace the file, and expose the truth behind a century of superstition. I started with the local archives in Beaufort County. Most of them had been closed since the courthouse collapse, but an elderly librarian named Mrs. Langley let me in after hours. She spoke quietly, almost apologetically. "There's something you should see," she said, handing me a thin folder marked in faded ink. "C. Whitmore missing 1923. Inside were her last notes, typed, yellowed, yet remarkably preserved. On the final page, there was a small smear of black ink beside her signature. I turned the sheet over. On the back, written faintly in pencil, were 2 words: his patient. Later that night, I checked into the same inn where Clara had stayed a century earlier. Out of curiosity, I opened my laptop and searched through academic databases for AR to V47. The file didn't exist anymore, not officially. But the metadata led me to a shadow link. I clicked it. A folder appeared on my desktop, Fairhaven Ledger PDF. It was blank. Then, one by one, lines began to appear, names I recognized: Monroe, Keller, Whitmore, Harrow. And then, at the bottom, active reader detected, entry 480 pending witness. I felt the temperature drop. My screen flickered. Somewhere beyond the window, thunder rolled, low and deliberate, like a heartbeat buried in the sky. The lights dimmed. Then I heard it. A faint sound behind me, soft but unmistakable, the rhythmic scratch of a pen on paper. I turned. There was no one there, just the reflection of my own face in the glass, until, for the briefest moment, another face overlapped mine. Dark eyes, calm expression, a scar along the jaw. Isaac. He looked straight at me through the reflection. His mouth didn't move, but the whisper was clear, inside my head rather than outside it. "You've seen the account. Now you keep it." The file closed on its own. My laptop powered down. When it restarted, the document was gone, but in its place was a new folder titled Due Accounts Current. Inside it, a single document. I opened it. The first line read, Section 16, The Last Witness, and below it, my name. The timestamp 2017 AM. Outside, the rain began to fall, slow, deliberate drops striking the window like knuckles tapping on wood. And through the hiss of the storm, I could swear I heard the steady rhythm again. Not typing this time. Writing. Ink on paper. Detente resumed. I think I finally understand what Clara meant in her last note. The ledger was never just a book. It's a vessel, a bridge, a balance sheet written across generations. And once you've read it, once you've understood it, your name isn't just recorded. It's remembered. Forever. The marsh is quiet now. No wind, no rain. Only the hush of the tide as it folds against the earth that once burned with the cries of men and chains. And in that silence, if you listen closely, you can still hear him. Not the ghost the stories made him out to be. Not the monster whispered about in classrooms or the vengeful spirit carried through corrupted code. No. What remains of Isaac is something smaller, quieter, something that sounds almost like prayer. The words come faint, as if carried through 2 centuries of fog and salt. Lord, if you remember me, remember all of us. The beaten, the nameless, the buried without song. I did not ask to be your reckoning, I only asked to be free. But if my rage became the ink that history forgot to dry, then let it write the truth. Let it write the pain. Let it write us back into the world. Each syllable vibrates like the hum of distant thunder. The magnolia trees around Fair Haven sway though no wind moves. The earth breathes, slow and heavy. The marsh water ripples inward, not out. For the first time in 200 years, the ledger lies open under the dawn light. Its pages washed clean, the ink dissolved into silence. The names once bound to vengeance are fading line by line as if forgiven, and yet one remains, the first Isaac Friedman. Below it, one last entry appears, not written in blood, nor ink, but light debt resolved. Record complete. The sound of chains slipping loose echoes faintly, not in horror this time, but in release. The magnolia blossoms fall like snow. Some say the marsh went still that morning, and for a single breath of time, the air smelled not of smoke or salt, but of iron turned to rain. Others say the digital file archive47 zip finally vanished that day, every copy deleted, every trace gone. Servers cleared themselves, as though something had reached across the network and exhaled. And those who once heard the whispers stopped hearing them. But there are a few who claim, on quiet nights when lightning trembles over the Carolina coast, the old courthouse clock still tolls once, softly, at 2:17 a.m., and if you listen close enough, beneath that single chime, you can hear Isaac's voice, not angry, not broken, just whispering into the dark, it's done, let them rest. The storm passes, the marsh exhales, the ledger closes, and with it, the long echo of one man's grief carried across generations finally comes to peace. The story of Fair Haven did not end with the closing of the ledger. It lingers, not as a curse now, but as a reminder written into the bones of the land and the conscience of a people still learning how to remember honestly. In classrooms across Beaufort County, teachers now speak Isaac's name, not as a ghost, but as a man. They teach his story beside the histories of rebellion, survival, and the quiet wars waged inside the human soul. They tell their students that justice, even when it comes from pain, is not vengeance. It's memory made real. A monument now stands where the courthouse once stood, a single block of black stone, unpolished, unmarked, except for 5 words carved deep enough to catch the rain. Every debt carries its name. Or at sunrise, the light hits those words and turns them gold. At sunset, they darken again, like ink remembering its purpose. Some visitors say when they stand beside it, they feel the air grow colder, as if someone were standing just behind them. Others hear nothing but the sound of cicadas, the rustle of magnolia leaves, the gentle lap of tide water against the shore. Historians now refer to the mystery of archive47 as the first digital haunting, but in time, even that term softened. The files stopped reappearing, the whispers faded. What remained were the records, the verified human ones. The plantation rosters, the court documents, the burial lists, all cross-referenced and finally restored to public record. Each name added back into history was a fragment of Isaac's prayer being answered, every restored story a voice released. As for the ledger itself, it was never found again. The marsh closed around its last resting place. Some believe it dissolved into the soil. Others say it simply went where it was always meant to go, back into the current of time. But late one night, a researcher at the South Carolina Historical Society reported a strange discovery. While digitizing the last of the plantation records, she found a blank document embedded deep in the database. It had no date, no metadata, and no file size, just a title, Fair Haven Resolution, TXT. Inside, a single line glowed faintly before fading from the screen, memory kept, balance restored. No one could trace it. The file vanished after she closed it. But she said, just before it disappeared, she heard a sound in her headphones, the faint scratch of pen on paper. Perhaps Isaac's work was never about revenge. Perhaps it was about balance, about forcing the world to remember the names that history erased. Because memory is not just what we keep, it's what we owe. And as long as someone still speaks his name, as long as one voice still whispers, Fair Haven, beneath the Carolina sky, Isaac is not gone. He is history itself, finally and forever heard. The screen fades from the burning magnolia grove to a slow sunrise over the Beaufort marshes. Mist drifts across the water like breath made visible. A low hum builds, a mournful cello, soft as the tide. The narrator's voice returns, quieter now, carrying the weight of centuries. History does not disappear. It waits. Beneath the water in the walls, inside the stories we refuse to tell. Isaac's name was never meant to haunt. It was meant to remind. Every line of that ledger, every whispered word, was a plea for the world to remember what it had buried. And though his ink has dried, his truth still stains the soil where he stood. The camera moves through the ruins of Fair Haven, now overtaken by green, roots crawling through stone, vines swallowing what was once pain. A lone magnolia tree stands where the courthouse burned, its petals drift into the marsh, each one carrying a reflection of faces: Clara, Daniel, Elise, James, those who chased the story too far and became part of it. The narrator continues, voice trembling like wind through glass. Some debts are not about money but memory. Some reckonings are not punishments but promises to never forget. Fair Haven is not a ghost story. It is a confession written by time itself, a truth that refused to drown. The music swells, blending with the sound of rain. On screen, the black stone monument comes into view. Water runs down its carved words. Every debt carries its name. As the last note fades, the screen darkens to black. Then, faintly, as if written in light across the void, one last line appears, for those who were never recorded, yet remembered still. A moment of silence, then the distant toll of a bell, one chime exactly at 2:17 a.m. The credits roll not as names, but as whispers, fragments of lost records, partial census entries, signatures of the enslaved, all scrolling upward, endless, like a river reclaiming its tide. And just before the final fade-out, a single sound lingers, the scratch of a pen on paper. Then a whisper, low and resolute, account closed, a fade to black. I've spent years chasing ghosts through archives, maps and broken records, trying to piece together what really happened at Fair Haven. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this was never a tale about revenge or curses. It was about silence. The silence of history. The silence forced upon those whose stories were deemed unworthy of ink. Isaac was not just a man, he was the voice of every name stripped from the page. His ledger was not a book of vengeance. It was a cry for balance, for remembrance, for truth to stand where lies had reigned too long. When I visited the marsh last spring, I found nothing of the old plantation, no ruins, no courthouse, not even a stone, just water and wild magnolias. The air was still but heavy with memory. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper through the reeds. Not words exactly, but a rhythm, a slow, steady beat, like a pen touching paper. And I understood then Isaac's work had ended. But the duty he carried had passed on. Every historian, every writer, every person who dares to remember, each of us holds the pen now. We are the new keepers of the ledger, though ours is written not in blood or ink, but in compassion, in honesty, in the refusal to forget. The story of Fair Haven belongs not to the dead, but to the living who must decide what their memory is worth. It teaches that history, no matter how deeply it's buried, will rise, because truth is not fragile. It endures, it waits, it forgives. And somewhere beneath the quiet Carolina sky, where the marsh meets the tide, I like to believe Isaac finally found peace. His name, once bound to pain, now rests among the magnolias, softly spoken, eternally free. Every debt carried forward, every name remembered. The wind shifts, the last petal falls, and the story at last is complete.